Good evening, everyone. On behalf of
Good evening.
Bombay Ophthalmic Association and Maharashtra Ophthalmic Association, I welcome you all on for this free session. For this session, we have got Dr. Anil Kulkarni sir, Dr. Anand Pangarkar sir, and Dr. Rajesh Joshi sir as a judges. I would like to give brief introduction of our respected judges. Dr. Anil Kulkarni sir has started his career in ophthalmology from 1977, and he was worked as a lecturer in SRTR Medical College, Ambezogai. Then he worked as honorary assistant professor and professor. He is presently a DNB teacher, a recognized DNB teacher, and he is very good in Mediconomics, as I heard about him. And he is a chairman of Amel Lasers and Research Private Limited. He is chairman of Cathedral and Research Private Limited. He is founding member and ex-manager of Alliance Nabai Hospital at Miraj. He is the president of Netra Jyoti Foundation. He is ex-honorary professor and head of department at Government Medical College and Hospital Miraj. He is founder, chairman, and member of Prathamesh Leisure Center Miraj. He is founder, chairman, and director Netra Baba Refractive Surgery Center Miraj.
Arey Nankumar. No.
He has
Just stop
taught
that,
so many
man.
ophthalmologists and trained so many.
You go to the students and
Sir.
their presentation.
Sir,
I think we should go to presentation.
okay.
Yes.
With
So Dr. Sneha Makhija, thank you Dore sir for kind introduction. Dr. Sneha Makhija, are you there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Please share the screen.
Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes, very much.
Visible.
The time is presentation for 6 minutes and the discussion is 2 minutes. But if you overshoot the time, the discussion might take a toll on that. So please presently stick to your time. You can start now.
Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, BOA and MOS, for this opportunity. I'm Dr. Sneha, and I'll be presenting Lights, Camera, Abrasion, a case series of photokeratitis and literature review. Photokeratitis is an acute clinical entity characterized by damage to corneal epithelium due to exposure to UV light from artificial as well as natural sources. Welder's arc or flash, as we know, and snow blindness are the better known entities and are mainly caused by UVB and UVC light. Coming to the spectrum of light, we know that anything less than 400 nanometers is ultraviolet light, which is not visible to naked eyes. UV rays are further divided into UVA, B, and C. UVA, having a higher wavelength, has deeper penetration of ocular tissues as compared to UVB or C. So UVB and sometimes C are the main culprits for causing photokeratitis. Chronic exposure to UV rays is known to cause pterygium, cataracts, OSSN, etc. We present a case series of 8 people working for an ad campaign who presented 4 hours after work, 5 males and 3 females, age ranging between 23 to 45 years, who presented with symptoms of pain, photophobia, lacrimation, and no respiratory symptoms. The best corrected visual acuity of the first 7 patients ranged between 6.9 to 6.12 in both eyes, and local examination revealed confluent SPKs in both eyes with superficial congestion, and the rest of the local examination was within normal limits. Case 8, the most severe affected, a 23-year-old model, had a BCV of 618 in the right eye and 6.9 in the left eye. The general examination revealed generalized skin burn over the exposed areas. Local examination revealed bilateral congestion, lid edema. Right eye showed temporal epithelial defect of about 4/3 mm, and the left eye showed diffuse SPKs, and the posterior segment was normal. Now coming to the management, case 1 to 7 were managed with topical lubricants and antibiotic eye drops. 4 of these resolved in a day, and all of them showed no signs or symptoms at the 2-day follow-up. case 8, we did the above as well as placed BCL in both eyes. We gave cyclopentolate eye drops and vitamin C tablets. On day 1 follow-up, the epithelial defect in the right eye had decreased. And on day 4 follow-up, the epithelial defect had healed and the vision had come back to 6 and 6. However, confluent SPKs were present. So we continued lubricants. We added loteprednol eye drops and cyclopentolate eye drops were stopped at this point. On 6 weeks follow-up, there were no SPKs, there was no conjunctival staining. The tear film breakup time in the right eye was 1 second, in the left eye was 3 seconds. So we continued topical lubricants and peeling of the burnt skin was seen. The systemic management of the patient, meaning the skin, was managed by the dermatological department. There was a use of HMI 4K light for the ad campaign in an open area. The worst affected, that is case 8, was at a distance of ranging between 7 to 10 feet for a duration of about 6 hours. So we instantly notified the advertisement campaign manager as well as the light technician, and the particular light was flagged and replaced. We went to search for similar case histories and we found that there was an NBC News correspondent who similarly had an HMI light malfunctioning. So we did a further literature search and we found that there are several lights which cause this. So there are lights like theater lights, restaurant lights, poultry workers are also similarly affected, night clubs, germicidal aquarium lamps, and more recently germicidal lamps for COVID-19. Okay, which are mainly by UVC lamp. So coming to the pathology, so UV rays cause genetic, cellular, and immunological changes. 500 millijoules per centimeter square is enough to cause this. And these result in pro-mutagenic changes, which can further lead to OSSN and BCC. We went to the particular website and we found that the safety advice is only available on request. FDA has certain guidelines and there are regulations in place, but there's a need for strict implementation and adherence and public awareness. So we created a public advisory where we also stressed upon the need for use of protective glasses and regular safety checks. These lights are everywhere around us, so we must be very wary of these lights. So the take-home message is cases of photokeratitis must be promptly recognized and treated. Concerned authority must be informed and light in question should be replaced. Need for public awareness and adherence of rules, and there's a need for regular safety checks. These sources made for an interesting read while we were writing up our study. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Sneha. Over to judges. Judges, please.
Madam, was the corneal sensations recorded?
Sir, on day 1, in case 8, it was not recorded. Actually, in all cases, it was not recorded on day 1. On day 2 follow-up, we recorded it and it was found to be normal in the first 7 cases. And the case 8 was recorded on day 4 after the epithelial defect had healed.
Because the first day you mentioned SPKs,
Yes,
I
sir.
think it would have been better if you had thought about the corneal sensations also, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Why
Sneha
did you
ma'am,
ask the
please
GPO
stop
for
your
this?
screen sharing.
Sorry.
And you infer that these are the particular lights which have gone bad, or it is that complete class of the light which is producing this kind of burns for the cornea?
So, sir, these metal halide lights are known to cause this. There have been, like I said, there was one lay press report of a news reporter having a similar incident. And also, when you go to these, when you read up on the website, these are known to cause. So the metal halide is inside a enclosed box.
No, Madam, you said that the bulb was changed. That's what I'm asking you.
So
When
the
it-
bulb is inside an aluminum reflector, and when that bulb breaks, then UV light is emitted. So which requires regular safety checks to be sure that it's not broken inside.
Sure, sure.
These metal halide lamps all emit a wide spectrum light, which also consists of UVC light.
Yes, sir. And to protect it, there's a UV filter which has to be.
There are two things. First is in case this metal halide is converted into an arc one, then the intensity of the light is more. And there is something wrong with the UVC filters or UV filters attached to these lights, which would prevent this thing from happening. So perhaps you should have tried to find out what was the spectrum of these particular lights, and whether it is the spectrum of the light itself, something going wrong with it, or overexposure to it for longer duration caused it. Anyway, but good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I would just like to add, it was actually all of the above mentioned factors by you, because the duration of exposure was 6 hours. It was an entire campaign shoot and they were exposed to it.
Why I'm asking this is because you should have had mentioned that many cars tend to have headlights as metal halide lamps.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And
Yes.
that white light has a better penetration during the fog times and at night. And this is a novel feature, but they do not cause UVC exposure. In this case, it caused because this man was nearest, one thing. And secondly, he was exposed to that for 8 hours, 6 hours, whatever. That was a long duration.
Yes, sir.
And it has a bearing on even the UVC lights which are being promoted as germicidal photo equipment.
Correct, sir.
Ah.
So it makes it even more relevant in today's time, sir.
Yes. So, next, please, Dole Saab.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Due sir, we can go ahead with the next. Due sir. Okay, so the next presentation is by Dr. Aishwarya Akulkar. Dr. Aishwarya there?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Please start sharing your screen. We already
Oh.
put the message. It's evaluation of post-operative IOP changes following cataract surgery and risk factors. Please
Sir,
start
my
your presentation. Yeah, your
Oh.
slides are visible. You're audible.
Okay, sir. Good evening, everyone. Today's my topic of presentation is evaluation of post-operative intraocular pressure changes following cataract surgery and its associated risk factors. Cataract is one of the leading cause of preventable blindness in the world. As there is no medical treatment for cataract, surgical management is the only treatment option. Complications of cataract surgery includes changes in intraocular pressure beyond the normal range, among many others, which may have dreadful effects on the eye. Aims and objective includes to study the changes in intraocular pressure post-cataract surgery and its associated risk factors. After ethics committee approval and written informed consent, a prospective longitudinal study was conducted on 60 patients aged above 40 years who underwent surgery for senile cataract from September 2019 to January 2021 at the rural tertiary care hospital. We excluded patients with history of glaucoma, intraocular pressure more than 21 millimeters of mercury, traumatic cataract, patients of pediatric age group, and patients with intraoperative complication. Data was collected and shown on and taken on the proforma. Preoperative data included age, gender, eye, laterality, past history, anterior segment examination, and preoperative intraocular pressure. Intraoperative data included technique of cataract surgery. Postoperative data included anterior segment evaluation, which was done with slit lamp, and intraocular pressure was measured with non-contact tonometer on post-op day 1, 3, and 7. In our study, 63.3% were males and 36.6% were females, with the most common age group being 51 to 70 years. Similar results were noted by Ali et al. In our study, we included 45% of patients who underwent small incision cataract surgery and 51% underwent phacoemulsification. The parameters were evaluated by descriptive statistics like mean, standard deviation, percentage. Pre and post-operative parameters were compared by students paired t-test at 5% and 1% level of significance using the software Systat version 12. All the patients showed a similar trend of change in IOP. Given below is a graph, a bar chart showing a trend in IOP. We noted a significant transient rise in IOP to 17.55 plus or minus 3.96 millimeters of mercury on post-op day 1. Similar results were shown by Sengupta et al. And Renner et al. This is due to obstruction of trabecular meshwork by viscoelastic material, lenticular debris, inflammatory material occurring maximally 3 to 7 hours post-surgery up till first 24 hours. This was followed by an average decline in IOP to 15.62 plus or minus 3.17 millimeters of mercury on post-op day 7. This declining trend was corroborated by Shingleton et al. This could be due to posterior shift of anterior capsule, which causes zonules to exert posterior traction on ciliary body and scleral spur. As a result, trabecular meshwork and Schlemm's canal expands. This ultimately increases the outflow facility and intraocular pressure consequently decreases. Risk factor which we consider in our studies are given below in the table. Out of 60 patients, 50% had a history of excessive tissue handling and longer surgical time by trainee surgeons. Bomer et al. Reported that postoperative IOP elevation was significantly higher for inexperienced surgeons due to surgical trauma, inducing release of iris pigments and serum proteins, thereby obstructing the trabecular meshwork. 35% patients showed obvious retained viscoelastic material on post-op day 1. Retained ophthalmic viscoelastic devices obstruct the trabecular meshwork, causing the rise in postoperative IOP, as also shown by Arjuna et al. Dispersive viscoelastic retain more in the AC as they adhere more to intraocular tissues. 11.677% patients had a pre-existing pseudoexfoliative syndrome. A study by Persian and et al. Also reported IOP spikes associated with pseudoexfoliation. This is due to release of inflammatory mediators, reducing the anterior chamber outflow. 5% patients were noted to be steroid responders. Kersey JP reported that steroid responders have a greater risk of rise in IOP, and cessation of steroids normalizes the IOP. 3.3% patients had a cortical remnants post-surgery. Similar results were reported by Romero Aroca. Remnant lens fragments induce severe autoimmune inflammatory reaction, causing the trabecular meshwork to get clogged. Finally, to conclude, cataract surgery induces a transient rise in IOP in first 24 hours, followed by a gradual decline in IOP in next 7 days following cataract surgery. The transient rise in IOP is multifactorial, and single or combination of factors may be responsible for the same in each patient. These were my references. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Aishwarya.
Yes, sir.
Over to judges.
Madam, you tested your intraocular pressure by non-contact tonometers.
Yes, sir.
Have you taken into account the variations which you get with these NCTs? Have you compared it with your control group?
No, sir. Being in, it was a one group study, sir. We didn't compare it with any other.
Yeah, because you relied on one machine for taking the readings.
Yes, sir.
Then whether there is a natural variation, that also has to be looked for, right? Rather than
Yes, sir.
blaming it only on the surgery. And then you mentioned something about dispersive viscoelastic. Which was this dispersive viscoelastic which was used?
Sir, Viscoat.
Viscoat.
So we included it's available
You are
in
talking
the
about sodium hyaluronate or HPMC or chondroitin sulfate.
Sir, sodium hyaluronate.
Okay, fine.
Dr. Aishwarya, can you please stop sharing your screen?
Aishwarya, just one question.
Yes,
You
sir.
mentioned about SICS and THECO, isn't it?
Yes,
So
sir.
was there any difference of pressure between two? And the second question is, you said about steroid responders. You measured intraocular pressure on 1/3 and 7th day. No?
Sir, I can't hear you. Hello?
No, Rajesh sir is asking that how did you say that it's a steroid responder within a day or two?
Yes, sir. Actually, my study previously was a study of more follow-up. I had considered, but due to this COVID period, I reduced it, and even the number reduced. So I couldn't exactly conclude on it.
Aishwarya, this is your thesis topic?
Yes, sir.
So out of the record, I would suggest you to delete that
Sir,
thing because
I-
steroid responders will take some time. And
Yes, sir.
SICS and phaco, did you find any? I think that would be more relevant because intraocular rise of intraocular pressure may occur if you have hard cataract, then with more distribution of the energy to the ocular tissues.
Yes, sir. I'll consider it, sir.
So you have to
I think you should have made four.
consider all these things. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You should have had made 4 groups. First group should have been trainee surgeons.
Yes,
Other,
sir.
there should have been 3 or 4 groups of people or patients.
Okay.
First is trainee surgeons and the accomplished surgeons or established surgeons. Second is SICS and phaco. And Dr. Kulkarni sir has rightly said about the NCT. See, there are many issues. It means first you are not clear what viscoelastic substance was used. Second,
Yes,
whether
sir.
it had any correlation with the phaco time as suggested by Dr. Rajesh Doshi. Third, whether the surgery was eventful or not.
Oh,
In
yes, sir.
where there was excessive intraocular pressure noted by you, was there a retained cortex? Was the surgical time more? Was there corneal edema? Because the corneal edema could have affected your NCT readings. And
Yes, sir.
these NCT readings should have been first calibrated in different age groups and found out that what is its reliability? Means if it gives you a reading of 16, how many times it could be 14 and how many times it could be 18, that kind of range. So you have
Okay,
to
sir.
specify that your even NCT readings was not just one-off reading, but an average of 3 or 4 readings.
Yes, sir. I had taken an average. I didn't mention it, but yeah, three readings were taken and then average was taken.
And I appreciate your effort in comparing your results every now and then with others' results. But then at least let us first know your results. Like for example, you are recorded, let us say in 2 cases, maximum intraocular pressure. Let us have clinical picture of those patients during the intraoperative period to know, to judge for
Okay,
ourselves what was wrong, why did it happen.
Okay, sir.
Just
I do
small
consider it.
things which would help make it a better presentation. That's all.
Okay, sir.
Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. I think Dr. Ekta is
Hello.
not there. She could not make it. Devesh sir, she could not make it. I
Yeah.
think.
Okay.
Move
Our
on to
next
the next Dr.
present.
Sonali Gaikwad. Sonali,
Okay.
please share your screen.
Yes, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Very much.
Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Make it
Okay.
full screen.
Okay. Good evening, judges and respected professor, and thank you, BOA, for giving me this opportunity. I will be presenting a case report of tubercular meningitis presenting as bilateral lateral rectus palsy. We had a 14-year-old presenting to the emergency department who complained of drowsiness, headache, double vision, and vomiting since 7 days. On bedside examination, her best corrected visual acuity could not be assessed as the patient was drowsy. Her pupils were reactive to light. On cover test, she showed esotropia of both the eyes. Her EOMS of both the eyes showed abduction limitation. Rest of the cases were free and full and painless. Her fundus was normal, with no evidence of papilledema. This is her primary gaze, elevation, depression, restriction in the right lateral gaze, and restriction in the left lateral gaze. Her fundus was normal. As investigations were done with CSF showing a total, CBC showing a total count of 5,000. As there was no evidence of papilledema, a lumbar puncture was done, and that showed a clear colorless liquid with a total nucleated cells of 44 per cubic mm. She had lymphocyte predominance with elevated proteins and low glucose levels. Her CSF gene expert and pyrosequencing both showed the presence of tuberculous bacillus. Other investigations considering a normal CT scan that was done was normal. With an MRI contrast was done, which showed leptomeningeal enhancement, which was suggestive of inflammation, which was secondary to tubercular meningitis. Enhancement of the sixth nerve could not be documented as both the cuts were MRI cuts were very thick. Treatment that was started was anti-tubercular treatment, which was supplemented with IV steroids. She followed up with us after 2 weeks later with a vision of 6/6. Her pupils were brisk, fundus was normal, abduction deficit was still present, but showed improvement. This was in the primary gaze 2 weeks post starting AKT. The abduction was still present, but it showed improvement in right and left lateral gazes. Now for discussion, tubercular meningitis associated has increased mortality and morbidity. Now due to the broad, variable and non-specific clinical spectrum, early diagnosis is difficult. Unilateral or bilateral six-nerve palsy can be a false localizing sign if there is raised ICT. Increase in this case, increase in the CSF proteins, low CSF glucose, along with the gyral enhancement was very classical of tubercular meningitis. Now, why did the patient present with a bilateral six-nerve palsy? Cranial nerve palsies occur in 20 to 30% of patients with tubercular meningitis. The pathogenesis behind this includes gelatinous exudates that cause the entrapment of the cranial nerve. The sixth nerve is the most commonly affected one, followed by the third nerve. Bilateral involvement of the sixth nerve is extremely rare in tubercular meningitis. And the fundus examination is extremely important to rule out papilledema, which can be a false localizing sign in case of a bilateral lateral rectus palsy. To conclude, the mainstay of treatment in our country remains anti-tubercular medication, and they started empirically because of the endemic nature of the disease. Lateral rectus palsy usually resolves over time. Persistent palsies may require strabismus correction after 6 months when the angles stabilize. And presence of a palsy, lateral rectus palsy, along with a history of a low-grade fever, headache, alteration in the mental status is important, but it's not a pathognomic sign. And neuroimaging is extremely helpful, especially MRI with contrast, as it shows more sensitivity than CT scan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sonali. Please stop sharing your screen. Over to judges.
What was the contrast used for the MRI?
So gadolinium was used.
The same thing. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Made you think in terms of it being TBM?
Sir, as the patient belonged to a Muslim community, and also as TB is extremely endemic in our country, the first differential diagnosis that was considered was tubercular meningitis. And she had signs of meningism with neck rigidity and Kernick sign positive.
You have mentioned about ruling out raised intracranial pressure, many other reasons being a cause for the lateral rectus palsy as false localizing sign. You have shown a fundus picture. I don't know how you take it. Anyway, but one more thing that you could have done with the CSF, which would have told you that it is not because of raised in ICT.
Sorry, sir?
One more thing, one more test which you could have done with CSF, which would have told you that this is certainly there is no raised intracranial pressure.
So opening pressure of the CSF.
Yeah, you could have mentioned that.
Okay. Yes, sir.
How much fluid was drained in that tap?
So 10 cc's was taken, 5 to 10 cc's was taken.
And you could have mentioned what was the anti-tubercular line of treatment instituted.
So she was diagnosed as she was started with category 1 anti-tubercular medications, the rifampicin, isoniazid, ethambutol, and streptomycin.
Did you do an chest X-ray?
So chest X-ray was done, but unfortunately I could not procure the X-ray.
Well, even the report and the mention could have perhaps given it, had it been positive, this is how it starts, then it would have been helpful to confirm the diagnosis. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, our next presentation is by Dr. Naina. She will be presenting on to assess the awareness and knowledge regarding cataract and glaucoma in patients visiting OPD of a tertiary healthcare center. Dr. Naina, please start your presentation.
Yes, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
Good evening. My topic for today is awareness and knowledge regarding cataract and glaucoma in patients visiting OPD of a tertiary healthcare center. Cataract is the major cause of reversible blindness in India, reported to be responsible for 50 to 80% of bilateral blindness in the country. Glaucoma, on the other hand, is the second leading cause of vision loss in India. Around 12 million people suffer from glaucoma and 1.5 million are blind due to it. Early detection of glaucoma is often difficult because of its asymptomatic course in the initial stages. Studies have shown that more than 75% of glaucoma cases remain undiagnosed. A large proportion of the population has heard about the local term used for cataract, which is motia, and glaucoma, which is kala motia or jhamar. Very few are actually aware about it or have knowledge about it. Awareness about the nature and risk factors of a disease is known to affect the behavior for seeking intervention, and this is especially important in a disease like glaucoma. My study was a questionnaire-based cross-sectional study. It had 3 sections. First sections pertained to the demographics of the patient. The second had questions about cataract, in which the first 4 questions assessed the awareness, whereas the next 5 questions assessed the knowledge about cataract. Section 3 had questions about glaucoma, in which the first 4 questions assessed the awareness, whereas the next 6 questions assessed the knowledge about glaucoma. The source of awareness for both cataract and glaucoma was also inquired. Questions asked to assess knowledge required information and understanding, and the questions assessing awareness merely required information about the subject. The criteria for awareness and knowledge was set randomly with at least 50% and 30% correct responses respectively. Diagnosed cases of cataract and glaucoma were excluded, and the survey was done by trained healthcare professionals. A majority of the population, that is 24%, were graduates, which was followed by 12th pass participants. A majority of the population were clerks or shopkeepers, which was followed by unskilled workers. 81% of the total population had heard the term cataract. 73% were aware, and 67% had some knowledge about it. A total of 47% did not know that blindness from cataract could be prevented. 44% were unaware that the treatment of cataract was possible, and 20% of the population confused cataract with glaucoma. A total of 60% of the participants had heard about the term glaucoma. 39% were aware, and 27% had some knowledge about glaucoma. 69% did not know that glaucoma could lead to loss of vision. 75% did not know that blindness from glaucoma could be prevented. 65% did not know that treatment of glaucoma was possible, and none of the participants were aware that glaucoma has a asymptomatic course. Out of the total population having awareness about cataract, around 92% had knowledge about it as well, which was statistically significant. And out of the total population having awareness about glaucoma, around 69% had knowledge about it as well, which was also significant. Well-educated participants were more likely to be aware about both cataract and glaucoma than lesser educated participants, and the level of education had a significant association with awareness of both cataract and glaucoma. As we can see in the chart, 46% had good education and were aware about cataract. 33% had good education and were aware about glaucoma. 37% had good education and had some knowledge about cataract, and 23% had good education and had some knowledge of glaucoma. Of the 73% participants who were aware about cataract, around 48% were aware about glaucoma as well, out of which 86% were well educated. 4% were aware about glaucoma but not about cataract. Out of the 67 persons who were aware about glaucoma, around a majority had knowledge about glaucoma as well, out of which 87.5% were well educated. 2% had knowledge about glaucoma but not about cataract. This chart shows that friends and family were the major source of information in both glaucoma and cataract. Of all the participants whose informant was family or friend, around 74% were well aware about cataract and 96% were well aware about glaucoma. 4% of the study population had a positive family history of glaucoma, out of which 75% had awareness about glaucoma and 50% had knowledge about it. It was observed in the study that people could confuse glaucoma for other eye conditions because of similar terminologies. In this study, there was no significant relationship between awareness and knowledge about cataract with age and gender. However, relationship of awareness of glaucoma was significant with age. In this study, awareness and knowledge was better among individuals with higher education and among close acquaintances of cataract and glaucoma patients. None of the respondents knew that glaucoma was an asymptomatic disease, which was a matter of great concern. Close relatives are the most common source of information on both cataract and glaucoma. And overall, the awareness about cataract and glaucoma in the Indian general population is poor. especially that of glaucoma being worse than that of cataract. The limitation of my study was it was drawn from a very specific practice environment. The sample size was small. The findings cannot be generalized to the populations, and interviewer bias could not be completely eliminated. In conclusion, I would like to say that public awareness of both cataract and glaucoma, especially glaucoma, is very low. Communicating visual prognosis by primary health clinicians and primary eye care practitioners would help enhance the knowledge and compliance among patients. The aim of education should focus not only on modifying individuals' perception of risk of vision loss, but also on providing information regarding the benefits of early detection and treatment. And in addition, education programs should also be oriented towards the involvement of friends and family members in supporting the seeking of eye care and in elevating the fear or anxiety concerning the treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naina. You can stop sharing your screen. Over to judges.
Madam, were you the only person who actually took that survey, or there were other people involved?
Sir, me and one of my colleagues, both of us.
Was it your thesis topic?
No, sir.
No, because you said there's a observer bias. That's what I was asking.
No, sir, it is not my thesis topic. But sir, most of the questions were leading questions. So if the patient did not answer the question by the first line itself, I did elaborate it a little to get an answer from the participant.
Yes, but your presentation was good and fluent. Thanks for that.
Thank you, sir.
Did you specify what did you define as good education?
Yes, sir. I used Kuppuswamy scale, the socio-economic scale, and I divided the participants into 7 categories. And sir, I took a cutoff. So I took 10th pass as a cutoff, and anybody who was above 10th pass was considered educated, well educated.
What do you think? You have mentioned about the relatives telling and sharing their knowledge and information. You've shared about the media, but in my mind, there is an important factor which helps make an impression on a general individual about awareness or knowledge of that condition. Did you find about it?
Sir, what about media?
One particular factor which I would rate above all these things, which will influence many people around and make them aware about the condition. In fact, if you say there are 2 factors. First is anybody in the family going blind because of glaucoma will have a more profound effect, one thing. And second one, anyone undergoing surgery for any of these conditions. Let us say somebody has not undergone a surgery in a family for any of these conditions. The general awareness about both these conditions amongst, say, let us say 50 people around this family will be low. But if 1 or 2 people undergo surgery for this, which is a major event in the family, then more people would register it. And if someone has lost vision and has gone blind because of it, then the impact will be even.
Right, sir. More.
Maybe we could have found it out.
Yes. Yes, sir.
But anyway, good study, good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Disha. Hello. Hello. Dr. Naina, please stop. Dr. Disha, our next presentation is by Dr. Disha. She will be presenting on to assess the effect of digital devices on ocular surface and tear film of eye. You can start your presentation. Dr. Disha.
Unmute herself. Ask her to
Hello,
unmute.
Dr. Disha.
No, ask her to unmute herself.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am sending her message. You can start your presentation.
Yes.
Yes,
Just make it full
you are
screen.
audible.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay.
Make
Good
it a
evening,
full screen.
everyone. Good evening, everyone. Today's topic of my
Yeah, good evening.
presentation is effect of digital device on ocular surface and tear film of the eye. With the time and the advent of technology, the uses of computer, laptop, tablets, and smartphone has been steadily increasing in past few years. According to the American Optometric Association, as little as 2 hours of continuous digital device uses per day is enough to development of eye and the vision related problems, and it is referred to as a digital eye strain. The prolonged uses of these devices not only stress on visual system but also causes musculoskeletal strain and the circadian disturbances. Objective of my study is to evaluate the influence of the digital screen on the ocular health and to see if there is an association between the prolonged hours of usage of digital screen and the occurrences of dry eye, and to create awareness about the disease. The method of my my study was a cross-section study, and we include all the patients above the 10 years of the age who using the digital device for more than 2 hours per day, and we exclude the patients those who already been diagnosed with dry eye due to the mammalian gland dysfunction, ectropion, entropion, trachoma, and Bell's palsy, those who undergo an intraocular and conference users, those on topical anti-glaucoma agents of the systemic condition like the diabetes, hypertension, connective tissue disorder, and the systemic medication that known to causing dry eye. All the patients are evaluated by two methods: subjective method by Squid questionnaire and objective method by Summer's test, a fluorescent meniscus height, corneal staining. And after this assessment, dry eye diagnosis done by using the ADS, JDS criteria. This is a Squid questionnaire performer, and the patient are asked regarding the frequency of the symptoms and then severity of the symptoms, and then score is given out of 28. The results are as below. From chart 1, we can see that most common age group affected in my study between the 27 to 31 years of age group. From chart 2, we can see that the students are most common occupation affected out of the 4 occupations involved in the study. The mean duration of digital device uses was 9 hours per day, and the male have high mean uses than female, but it was not found to be significant. From chart 3, we can see that mobile phone was most commonly used by study population, laptop, and television. To assess the effect of duration of digital device, the patient can be divided into two groups: group 1 with less than 10 hours of exposure and group 2 with more than 10 hours of exposure. From this table, we can see that FVUT and speed score found to be significantly correlated between these two groups. From chart 4, we can see that the 50% of the patient had severe dry eye according to speed score, and among them 35 are male and 15 are female. From chart 5, we can see that 81% has normal Shermer's test, and 68% of the patient has moderate dry according to FVUT test. From chart 6, we can see that 72% of the patient has normal TM meniscus height, and from chart 7, we can see that 61% of the patient has corneal staining present. Among all the digital device uses, the laptop or computer causes maximum dry eye, which can be seen from chart 8, that is 72%. The current study aim is to estimate the prevalence of dry eye and its correlation with the duration of digital device uses. We found that 87% of the patients were in the group less than 30 years with high prevalence in the males. The mean duration was 9 hours per day, and the mobile phone was most commonly used digital device by study population. The prevalence of dry eye was 65% in group 1 who using digital device for less than 10 hours and 84% in those who using digital device for more than 10 hours. According to speed score, 89% had moderate to severe dry eye, and the speed score significantly correlated with the corneal staining and the duration of digital device uses. This can be interpreted as a patient with ocular surface damage were more symptomatic. The Shermer test was normal in 81% of the patient, and FVUT was less than 5 seconds in the 70 patients, but FVUT was significantly correlated with corneal staining and the duration of digital device uses. The TM meniscus height was normal in the 72% of the patient and is what not correlated with any variable in the study. And according to ADS, JDS criteria, 70% of the patient had dry with a significant male preponderance and the prevalence of dry maximum in the computer laptop users. And from this, I can conclude that there is a statistical increase in the speed score and decrease in FVUT with increased duration of digital device uses. And FVUT found to be better diagnostic test for dry as compared to other tests in the study. study findings say the need to educate and spread awareness about the decrease in screen time, choosing the optimal screen brightness and use of blue light cutting screen and Note 2020 in order to decrease dry and to prevent damage caused to ocular surface. The limitation of my study is the sample size more small, and we cannot generalize findings to other population as only few demographic criteria were included in our study. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Disha. Over to judges, please. Any queries, sir?
I feel, Disha, you should have studied it only amongst people below 30 years of age.
Yes, sir.
You see, the tear film breakup time and tear film characteristics are not the same. Moment you cross this age factor of 30, there are many other conditions which affect these things, and
Yes,
therefore will adversely affect one thing. Second thing, maybe I would have liked to include is whether any of these people were aware about the harmful effects of overexposure to digital devices.
Sir,
Would have helped. People who are aware of that will have break in their continuous monitoring of these digital devices. They will avoid continuous staring at the screen. They will avoid going very near the screen, because even the distance between the screen and your eyes and how you perform while using the digital device has a small bearing on the overall result. But anyway, good study, a lot of effort has gone in. Thank you.
thank you.
Next presentation is by Dr. Jigar on treatment modalities in orbital mucormycosis following COVID-19.
Hello, am I audible?
Hello, Dr. Jigar? Yes,
Yes,
you are
hello.
audible. Yes, you can
Yeah.
start.
Yeah, good evening. My topic is treatment modalities in orbital mucormycosis following COVID-19. Mucormycosis is an opportunistic fungal infection caused by fungus belonging to Mucormycetes group. Primary site of infection is either paranasal sinus or lung. It is associated with significant morbidity and mortality. It is generally affects who have dysfunctional innate immunity due to some disease or drugs, uncontrolled diabetes, organ transplantation, severe neutropenia, chronic use of immunosuppressive agents like corticosteroids, severe malnutrition are some major risk factors. Out of the all anatomical affections, rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis is the most common form occurring in diabetics. From there, it spreads rapidly to neighboring organs. Lung infection is relatively rare and is generally associated with chronic neutropenia. In India, its incidence is described to be higher following rainy season. High degree of suspicion and aggressive approach is the cornerstone to management of mucormycosis in order to significantly decrease morbidity and mortality. Our aim is to find out the extent of involvement of eye in post-COVID positive patients with comorbidity and management of it. This is a retrospective analysis of our experience of managing 40 consecutive patients with mucormycosis during 15th November to 15th January 2021. All were diagnosed and managed by a multi-speciality team. All the cases were shown to develop positive signs and symptoms of mucormycosis with an average of 17 days of RT-PCR positivity. All the 40 patients were treated with COVID-19 illness prior to their presentation with suspected mucormycosis. All the patients were immediately started on parenteral antifungal medications once KOH report confirmed. Liposomal amphotericin B was preferred but could be administered only in 25 patients. Rest 32% patients received amphotericin B in deoxycholate form due to economic consideration, and 5% with abnormal renal function had to be treated with posaconazole in order to avoid nephrotoxicity of amphotericin B. All patients were administered desferrioxamine also. Intralesional antifungal was not administered in any of 40 patients at any point of time before, during, or after surgery. All the 37 patients who consented for surgery, debridement of involved necrotic tissue was performed a day after KOH confirmation of fungus in biopsy sample. Decision for exenteration was governed by extent of orbital involvement and the visual potential. Orbital exenteration was performed by eyelid sparing technique with transverse blepharophy. Follow-up was of patients were done weekly for 1 month. And out of 40 patients, 32 patients developed symptoms of mucormycosis during the period of their hospital stay while recovering from coronavirus disease. The remaining 8 developed following discharge from their COVID care facilities. We basically divided patients in 5 groups on the basis of surgical intervention. Group A consists of 16 patients with having only sinus involvement. So a functional endoscopic sinus surgery was performed. Group B consists of 4 patients in which sinus and small part of orbit was involved. So FES plus orbital decompression was performed. In Group C, 12 patients were involved. So sinus and extensive orbital involvement. So FES and exentration was done. In Group D, 3 patients were there having sinus, orbit, and heart palate involvement. So FES, exentration, and heart palate removal was done. And 2 patients were having brain involvement. So craniotomy was also performed along with FES and exentration. Out of all patients who opted for surgical intervention, a total of 17 patients underwent exentration, while the rest 20 were managed successfully without exentration by means of aggressive surgical debridement along with intravenous antifungals. On follow-up examination, healthy granulation tissue was seen on medial side of tarsorrhaphy in 11 patients, with pus at tarsorrhaphy suture site in 5 patients. None of the patient had lung involvement at the time of diagnosis or subsequently. No correlation could be found between the CTSS score of COVID-19 and extent of involvement by mucormycosis. This is the MRI brain plus orbit suggestive involvement of mucormycosis in right eye, resulting in proptosis of eye. This is also another figure of MRI brain plus orbit showing involvement of mucormycosis. This is pre-operative and post-operative picture of a patient in which exentration was done. Conclusion, COVID-19 is associated with varied presentation and sequelae. Though being a relatively rare condition, mucormycosis is one of them. In the last 1 year, a total of 43 mucormycosis were diagnosed by our group, out of which 40 were seen in just 2 months. All 40 patients were RT-PCR positive of COVID-19. None of the 3 previously diagnosed of mucormycosis as COVID-19. All the 40 patients had severe COVID infection requiring oxygen supplementation and systemic steroids besides remdesivir for management. All were found to have found to have hyperglycemia at the time of presentation and needed insulin for diabetes control. Uncontrolled diabetes and glucocorticoids are known to be risk factors for development of mucormycosis, as they are associated with immune suppression. Severe COVID-19 is known to be associated with immune suppression, and all the 3 factors were present at the time. The mucormycosis was developed during the second wave. During the first wave, the difference between first and second wave, it was the way it was managed. During first wave, there was no standard care and everyone received supplemental oxygen supportive care. During the second wave, all patients received glucocorticoid, and the role of corticosteroids as the mainstay of coronavirus treatment has got well established. First wave was during the summer, while second wave was followed rainy season in Ahmedabad. Mucormycosis in India is known to occur following rainy season. In summary, uncontrolled diabetes and use of glucocorticoids in the management of COVID-19 following rainy season, coinciding with the second wave of COVID-19. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jigar. Over to judges, please.
You have shown some cases in November 2020 as well, isn't it? Am I right?
Sir.
Hello.
Yes, he had shown it.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Jigar. No, in November 2020 also there were cases of mucormycosis, and now in the second wave, we all agree that second wave has started now this early summer, let us say March. What was the difference in the presentation, and what do you think caused mucormycosis at that time and now?
Sir, at the recent time, it has been postulated that use of instead of distilled water in the oxygen concentrators are the main culprit for developing mucormycosis recently. And earlier it was not like that. Earlier there was no shortage of oxygen, so there was no use of other than distilled water in oxygen concentrators. So that is also a cause, sir, for development of mucormycosis.
So you are talking about impure oxygen being given as the medical oxygen?
Yeah, sir.
No, he's not talking about that, sir. He's talking about the fluid used in the humidifier by giving oxygen.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That
No,
means where.
No, there is a difference between what you are saying, sir. The medical grade oxygen and industrial grade oxygen is also being now postulated to be responsible. But before that, it was being postulated that we are not using distilled water or normal saline in the humidifier while giving oxygen, which is responsible for the growth of mucormycosis in the oxygen pathway that is we are introducing, and that is responsible for production of this particular thing. Now it is being said that what we are giving is now industrial oxygen because we do not have medical grade oxygen. But I tried to find out from the literature, there is hardly any difference between the two. In fact, the purity of oxygen as supplied by the industrial function is even little purer than the medical grade oxygen. So I agree with that. You think, Jigar, any other factor that you feel is could be implicated in the etiology?
Sir, injudicious use of steroid is also, sir, responsible for development of mucormycosis.
Jigar, a few things from my side.
Yes, sir.
In fact, you should have shown few pictures. Okay. And second thing, you told about eyelid saving exenteration. In which conditions you considered that thing, and what was the follow-up?
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next, hello.
Yeah. Thank
The
you,
next
sir.
presentation is by Dr. Ashish. He will be presenting on to evaluate patient compliance for prone positioning after vitrectomy surgery using an innovative device. Dr. Ashish, you can start your presentation.
Good evening,
Dr. Ashish.
judges. Hello, good evening, esteemed judges and my colleagues. I thank BOA for providing me with this opportunity. I'll be presenting on the topic to evaluate patient compliance for maintaining prone position after vitrectomy surgery using an innovative device which me and my team have developed. So I am an equity stakeholder in a healthcare startup called Vision Cure Private Limited, who's manufacturing this device. So PVRS is an innovative device which has a sensor embedded in the headrest with data logging function, which is used to measure the compliance of patients to maintain face down position after vitrectomy surgery. It's an innovative device which helps patients in the sitting or in the lying down position. It helps to track the duration for which the prone position was maintained on daily basis. It's a patent pending technology. It helps to improve patient compliance and improves the surgical success. PVRS device consists of a furniture stool with a headrest on the top. So when the patients place their forehead on the cushion, the data is relayed by the sensor system inside. And on the right, as you can see, we can view it on the server on the website in the form of graphs. So on daily basis, we can track the duration for which the prone position was maintained. In the middle image, you can see the sensor is embedded right in the center of the headrest cushion. So this is the device setup. So all surgeries were performed by a single surgeon. Patients were asked to maintain prone position for a variable period as long as they were comfortable for the study. 11 patients were included in the study after informed consent. Study was conducted between October 2020 to March 2021. For macular surgeries, patients were asked to maintain prone position for 4 days. For detached surgeries, patients were asked to maintain face down position for 12 days. And one patient with open globe injury with RD was also asked to maintain face down for 12 days. So out of the 11 patients, 5 patients underwent macular hole surgeries. 5 patients were with retinal detachments. And one patient was a case of open globe injury with IOFP and RD. So our results were that the adherence for patients to maintain face down position was significantly better after macular hole surgery than compared to retinal detachment surgery, probably also because of the shorter duration of face down positioning which was advised. We also observed that the adherence was better in females compared to males about 5.5 hours average per day compared to males, which was 4.5 hours. Out of 11 patients who underwent surgery, all patients with macular holes underwent successful type 1 closure of the macular holes in the post-operative period. Out of 5 patients with detachment, 4 cases achieved anatomical success and 1 patient required resurgery in the post-operative period. And after the resurgery, also the retina was attached in that case. So this is a table which is showing the duration for which the prone position was maintained for the macular hole patients. So the compliance to maintain face down position reduced gradually as the days went by, and it was better in the daytime period and less in the nighttime. So a similar table we have made for the retinal detachment patients. For simplicity purpose, initial 5 days period has been included in the table. So vitrectomy surgery, coming to discussion, patients undergone vitrectomy surgery require to maintain face down position for a period of 4 days to 2 weeks. The real world scenario is that it is very difficult for patients to maintain face down position, maybe due to back problem, uncomfortable posture, giving chest pain or breathlessness. So this is one initiative which we are trying to help patients improve compliance to maintain face down position. And we observed good acceptance of our device to maintain face down position after the surgery. And the significance of face down positioning to treat retinal detachment patients needs to be examined further in the future studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashish. Over to Dennis.
Yeah.
Any queries, sir?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes,
Am I-
yes, sir.
Ashish,
Yes,
my
sir.
compliments for this small little good device that you have made.
Thank you, sir.
I want to ask you whether you are aware about the recent findings about the requirement of maintenance of prone position after macular hole surgery.
Sir, it is still debatable. There are groups in favor of both. Some say only 1 day position is also sufficient. There are groups saying that even if they don't maintain face down position, it is okay. But so at least for large macular holes, more than 600 microns, or a traumatic macular hole, secondary macular holes, those cases do require, I think, face down positioning. Surgery is done by trainee surgeons. I think
Anyway,
Ashish, how much this cost?
first 48 hours, most of the macular holes is fine. That's why that slide, what hurt me was, or rather it called my attention was that we had asked for 4 days. Doesn't matter, no issues. Second thing, what do you think has been taken care of by this particular device? Just give me 2 factors which you have taken care of by this device.
so one is patient able to maintain face down position in the sitting position. And also, sir, there was an angled mirror, which is also there. So when the patients look in the mirror, no, they can observe objects in front of them. So they can talk to their relatives while maintaining face down position.
I feel that a very important aspect of this face down positioning is the compliance. This compliance is even more difficult than with obtaining compliance with anti-glaucoma drugs. People tell you falsely because they, while sleeping in prone position, they develop pressure on the chest, they get fed up, they don't want to sit up and do all those sorts of things. But once you present them with this hard data and facts that you have been able to maintain it only for 5 hours, you should have maintained it for more hours. That is showing them the mirror, and that is what will encourage them or will prevent the slippage from this compliance. So I will feel that, see, you can maintain this position by any other device, but your device is scoring in getting real-time data, and our ability to show that data to the patient thus ensuring that the compliance is real. So that is where the equipment is scoring real-time data.
Yes, sir.
From which the patient cannot escape.
Yes, sir. We'll be able to maybe provide guidelines as well by conducting larger studies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our
Thank
next
you, sir.
presentation is by Our next presentation is by Dr. Sneha on novel collagen imaging using ultra high resolution polarization sensitive OCT in healthy suspect and keratoconus corneas. Dr. Sneha, you can start your presentation.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, you are audible.
Make it full screen.
Good evening, everyone. The topic of my presentation is novel collagen imaging using ultra-high resolution polarization-sensitive optical coherence tomography in healthy, suspect, and keratoconus corneas. Evolution of diagnostic. Yes, it is full screen.
No, it's not in the full screen mode.
Right lower corner.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can go ahead with your presentation, I think.
Okay, go ahead.
Full screen.
Start. Continue with your
Yes.
presentation.
Evolution of diagnostic modalities in refractive surgery from topography in 2000s to biomechanics in 2010s and epithelial mapping in 2020s has been a refractive boom. It has helped in perfect decision making and choosing the right surgery for the patients. Here are a few cases that present to us on regular basis in a refractive clinic. The first one shows normal topography and normal biomechanics, an ideal case to go ahead with the refractive surgery. The second one is an indicator of keratoconus in corneal topography as well as biomechanics, an absolute contraindication. The third one is a patient which presented with post-classic ectasia, presented 3 years later after surgery and was having clearing of vision. These are basically clear-cut cases where we come to know whether we should go ahead with the surgery or avoid the surgery. Here are a few set of confusing cases that present to us regularly, and they form 35% of our OPD cases. The first one shows thin cornea, no keratoconus. The second one shows suspicious bad D, but no normal biomechanics. And the third one has a normal topography, but abnormal biomechanics. What should we do in such case scenarios?
Slides are not moving.
Sorry, sir?
Slides is the same.
Start PowerPoint presentation.
Share your screen.
Yes,
then go to PowerPoint mode. You need to share your
screen.
Yes, I'm trying.
Yeah, now go to, perfect.
Yes. So which parameters should we give more weightage to? Should it be corneal topography, which is an indirect measurement of corneal structure, or corneal biomechanics, which is an indirect measurement of corneal strength? This led to a research question. Is there a way where we can quantify corneal collagen distribution using an in vivo non-touch technique? We stumbled upon an article which showed imaging of birefringent properties of keratoconus corneas by polarization-sensitive optical coherence tomography. On reviewing the literature, we found the use of X-ray scattering techniques to quantify the orientation and distribution of collagen in corneal stroma and theoretical model of preferential collagen fibrillar arrangement published by Keith Meek. This led to our journey to build our own PSOCT machine, which we did in collaboration with the Medical University of Vienna. We could use anterior segment OCT also for this, but it had a drawback of not being able to show the uniform distribution of the collagen. Thus, we use PSOCT, which projects polarized light over the cornea and measures the way the polarization state of the light is altered. All the layers of the cornea take up the polarized light except the stroma. It was this property of cornea which we took the advantage of for building the PSOCT machine. PSOCT imaging started in June 2019 at our institute. On the right-hand side, you can see the images of the collagen in the cornea through this machine. It is the arrangement of collagen fibrils in a normal human cornea, checkered arrangement located centrally. They show mirror symmetry in their collagen fibril distribution, and the strength of the cornea is maintained due to the uniform fibril distribution. Now, similar to the topographic maps which show warm and cool colors, these images also show the warm and the cool colors. The cool colors, that is purple and blue, indicate the least phase retardation. That means it has the least change in polarization of light, which is because of the uniform arrangement of the collagen fibrils in a normal and a healthy cornea. In cases of diseased cornea, there is increased phase retardation, which causes warmer colors. So we performed a study where we used 50 normal eyes, 35 suspicious and 50 keratoconus eyes, and we grouped them as normal topography, normal biomechanics showing checkered arrangement, suspicious topography with normal biomechanics showing checkered arrangement, suspicious biomechanics showing partial loss, thin cornea showing partial loss, keratoconic cornea showing complete loss of the checkered arrangement, and post-mylectasia showing complete loss. So what was known as corneal tomography is gold standard for diagnosis of keratoconus. The disease pathology is in corneal stroma, is not directly imaged by topographers. PSOCT clearly differentiates the collagen fibril distribution between healthy and keratoconus. Suspicious cornea reveal a unique distribution of collagen indicating early changes, and it is most strongly bound in normal, followed by suspect and then keratoconus. And PSOCT can become an integral part for KC imaging and for post-refractive surgeries in suspicious topography. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneha. Over to judges, please. Any queries, sir?
Yes, Dr. Shreya.
Yes,
Dr. Sneha.
Yes, sir.
Let us say you had those 100 cases, isn't it? 50 were normal,
yes, sir.
And 50 were suspect or thin corneas or whatever.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell me that the corneal biomechanics and the corneal topography point out or help in early detection of keratoconus, or giving you an idea that keratoconus should be suspected in these cases? And in those cases where these modalities failed and PSOCT. See, PSOCT is an advancement, there is no doubt about it.
Yes, sir.
Would you be able to tell me what is its biggest advantage and what is the difference between an SD-OCT and PSOCT?
So basically in PSOCT, in suspicious corneas where the biomechanics was better, the collagen distribution was more deviated towards the healthy corneas. But where the biomechanics was little towards the weaker side, the collagen distribution was weaker. So it says that before the topographic manifestations coming in, we are able to detect early forming or suspicious corneas by the help of studying the collagen distribution.
The answer to my first question lies in the second question. The PSOCT scores over the SD-OCT in the sense that it gives you an idea about a specific tissue, in this case collagen.
Yes, it gives us the idea about collagen.
The first thing that is responsible for keratoconus is collagen.
Yes.
So if we could predict that keratoconus is going to result in these many numbers, this patient is susceptible to develop keratoconus, how is it going to help? Tell me.
So basically then we would not perform a refractive surgery for that patient, because there will be increased chances of
right. So we are going to reduce the chances of post-LASIK corneal ectasia in these many patients. Perhaps detect them early and perhaps do corneal cross-linking, collagen cross-linking in these cases, and perhaps avoid some of them going into frank keratoconus or ectasia.
Yes.
Thank you. Good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next presentation is by Dr. Aneri. He will be talking on presentation and management of eyelid cysticercosis, a rare case report. Dr. Aneri, you can start your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Aneri Shah, a second-year resident at Sula Civil Hospital, Ahmedabad. Today, I am here to present a rare case report on eyelid cysticercosis. Just a minute. Parasitic orbital infections are very common in developing world. Two most common parasites among this is Cysticercus cellulosa and Echinococcus granulosus. Cysticercus is a larval form of pork tapeworm Taenia solium. Predisposing factors for these infections are contaminated food or water, poor sanitation, or consumption of undercooked pork. Most common ocular site of involvement is extraocular muscles, followed by subconjunctival space, retina, or vitreous, and least commonly eyelids are involved. Cysticercus cysts are small in size initially. Its larval forms get encysted into the tissue, which progressively increase in size, causing severe symptoms. Simultaneously, death of these parasites within cysts releases abundant toxins and initiate inflammatory reaction, which can lead to blindness if patient is untreated in 3 to 5 years. So surgical excision of the cyst with anti-helminthic and anti-inflammatory cover is mandatory. A 6-year-old male patient presented to our OPD with complaint of left upper eyelid mass, which was present since 3 months. It was painless, subcutaneous, slowly progressive in size, nodular with medium consistency, and freely movable in eyelids. Patient came from lower socioeconomic background and took mixed diet. On ocular examination, facial symmetry was there with head posture erect. His extraocular movements were full and symmetric. On Snellen's, patient gave 6/6 vision in both eyes. His intraocular pressure with hyperination tonometry was 11 and 13 in right and left eye respectively. Anterior segment was clear, and fundus examination revealed cup disc ratio of 0.3 in both eyes with clear media and FR present. We undertook him to ultrasound B-scan, and hypoechoic lesion was appreciated. CBC revealed mild eosinophilia, which was suggestive of parasitic infection. NCCT brain was done, which was within normal limits, and neurocysticercosis was ruled out. Surgical excision of the whole cyst was carried out under general anesthesia with external incision, and wound was sutured with 6/0 vicryl sutures. This is the photo of post-op day 3 of the same patient. After excision, patient was started on oral albendazole and steroids according to the weight, and patient now is closely being monitored for any recurrence or inflammatory response, which could be precipitated by dying larva. The cyst was then sent to histopathological examination and biopsy, and we found fibrotic capsule which was attached with host. Under fibrotic capsule, there were larval form present with scolex, hootlets, and suckers present, and multiple convoluted spinal canal with mixed inflammatory infiltrate was noted. So cysticercosis diagnosis was confirmed with histopathological examination. Ocular involvement occurs in 15 to 45% of infected patients of cysticercosis. While the most common site of localization reported in Western studies is posterior, in Indian literature, the ocular adnexa is the most common site. In a study reported by Kruger, 35% of the cysts were found in subretinal space, only 5% in the anterior segment, and only 1% in the eyelids. Humans become infected by eating raw undercooked pork, and left side is most commonly involved due to direct branch of internal carotid artery from aorta. And for differential diagnosis, we should rule out dermoid cyst, sebaceous cyst, or hydatid cyst. Dermoid cyst being ruled out by CT scan because of the association with bony erosions, and externally hair follicles over surface can be observed. Sebaceous cyst contains small pigmented puncta, and hydatid cysts are much larger in size. For presentation, extraocular muscle involved patients presents with proptosis, pain, and diplopia. In optic nerve and intraocular cyst, diminution of vision is the most common presentation, and eyelid at some conjunctival cyst presents with localized swelling with redness. B-scan ultrasonography gives the characteristic picture of hypolucent area with highly reflective structure, which is scolex inside the cyst, which helps to identify the cyst as cysticercus. For medical treatment, we have 2 larvicidal drugs, albendazole and praziquantel. Sotelo compared these 2 drugs and found albendazole to be more effective and less expensive. Albendazole gets converted into albendazole sulfoxide in the body, and concurrent steroid administration eliminates its excretion. So it is more effective that way. During medical therapy, dying Cystic circus releases its toxins and induces severe inflammatory reactions, which can lead to vitritis and blindness. So it is mandatory to check for intraocular involvement of Cystic circus cyst. Orbital cyst, when small in size and when patients are asymptomatic, can be managed with 4-week regimen of oral albendazole with oral steroids in a tapering dose over 1 month. If the size of the cyst is large and patient is symptomatic, surgical excision with medical therapy as an adjuvant should be given. For the prevention of Cystic circus cellulosa, good hygiene measures should be practiced, such as washing raw vegetables and fruits before consumption, washing hands frequently, and avoiding consumption of raw or undercooked pork and other meat. So to conclude, cystic sarcosis is a fairly commonly observed condition in India, as it is a developing country with poor sanitary practices and geographical location. To confirm the diagnosis, USG B-scan and ELISA anti-cysticercal antibodies should be done. A combination of oral albendazole and oral steroids are given in neurocystic sarcosis cases. For intraocular involvement, surgical removal is a must with medical adjuvants, and surgical removal of the cyst in toto is important to prevent associated inflammation around the cyst. These are my references. Thank you.
Over to the judges.
Yeah, very nicely presented.
The incidence in your state, Gujarat, and why so?
It is a very rare condition, sir. Yeah. In 2 years, we've observed only 1 case of such eyelid cystic sarcosis, and it is less than 1%.
Why is it so in Gujarat? This is a case seen in Gujarat, Ahmedabad, am I right?
Yes, sir.
Why do you think it is less common in Gujarat?
Our government hospital being in Ahmedabad, we come across very heavy OPD, and we've observed 1 to 2 cases. So
I'm talking about the literature reports of the incidence of cystic sarcosis being less in Gujarat as compared to some other states, and I'm asking you why. Chalo. Okay, it doesn't matter. Let's skip that question. But otherwise, the workup was good. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Dole, you have to unmute yourself. You are muted.
Kulkarni sir, namaskar.
Sorry, sir.
Namaskar, sir.
Oh, sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. This was the last presentation in this session.
Okay.
It was a wonderful session.
1 minute,
I
Dole.
really want to thank-
One person is not presented. That is this ocular manifestations in head injury. It was the 3rd presentation, absent.
Sir, he could not come because of some hospital
No,
issue.
that is different. I'm just making it clear to everyone that
Yes,
was
sir.
Yes.
missing.
Correct.
Dr. Gaurav was to present in this session.
Sir, he was supposed to, but then since this hall has to be given for the another session, he went to the free paper session 4, sir,
Sure, sure.
presenting it there.
Thank you, Dr. Dore,
I
Dr.
want
Sumit,
to thank
organizers of BOA, and special thanks to Dr. Kulkarni sir and Dr. Rajesh for their inputs, and it has been a pleasure working with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank
giving
you.
this opportunity. Thank you, Sumit. And thank you, Dr. Dole. Right? Sure.
Thank you, respected judges, Dore sir, and all the participants. And we must applaud all the participants. As I spoke to them, like 70% of them are on the COVID duty in rotation. And still they managed to present in between their duties time, which is really commendable. So I congratulate everyone, and the results will be declared soon, and you will get on your email within a day's time. Certificates you will receive after 30th May of participation. And then I hand over the all to Nikhil Nashta sir. And thank you everyone. Good night for today.